Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. I am your host, Mr. Samuelson, and today we are talking about the Columbian Exchange and some related issues to the Columbian Exchange. Our essential question for today is, what was the impact of the Columbian Exchange on the Old and New Worlds? Old World refers to Afro-Eurasia, that is Africa, Europe, and Asia. New Worlds refers to North and South American and the Caribbean islands. Now, Columbus's landing. Let's backtrack right to that moment in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue and then landed in the Caribbean. Once he landed in the Caribbean, he met a group of people known as the Taino, and there was an exchange of goods. This exchange of goods represents the beginning of trade between the old and new worlds. This lesson is about an element of that exchange of goods known as the Columbian Exchange, because from this point forward, there is going to be a lot of trade between the old and new worlds. One of the most important goods to be exchanged were food crops, plants and animals used for food or the production of food. Now, in the old world, the Americas, there were a lot of foods that were native to the Americas, and the old world was completely ignorant of them. These are foods that are very well known and used throughout the world today. It includes beans, corn, potatoes. We think of Ireland as being famous for their potatoes, but it was in fact a New World crop. Tomatoes, pumpkins, peanuts, sweet potatoes, turkey, and chocolate. These are all New World staples. And before 1493, the Old World, Africa, Europe, and Asia, knew nothing about them. They'd never had any of these foods. Now, flip that around, and we have these Old World food crops that people living in the Americas had no idea about. These included cows and chickens and pigs, these domesticated animals. See, the Americas had no large domesticated food animals. Also, oranges and citrus fruit in general, most citrus fruit. Bananas, sugar, which is going to be very important to our story going forward. Coffee, rice, these were all things that were Africa, Europe, Asia in origin and had spread throughout those three continents by this time, but the Americas knew nothing about. After this exchange happens, we start to see an avalanche of goods moving from the Americas into Europe and from Europe into Africa and Asia, and goods moving from Europe into the Americas. And this full exchange of goods. Central America, really well known for bananas today, not a native crop. As stated before, Ireland, really known for potatoes, not a native crop. These are going to spread around and find new homes. Another thing that spreads is disease. Now, we've talked about this a little bit before, and we'll talk about it in greater depth going forward. But disease is going to play a big part in the story of the Western Hemisphere. See, in Afro-Eurasia, they've had these regular trade routes, the Silk Road, for a long time. And this means that a large number of people are going to have contact with each other. And this contact helps to spread diseases. We've talked about how the Black Death moved from Asia through the Middle East into Europe along these trade routes. Okay, this is happening in reverse as well. And disease is constantly moving through these three communities. And over the centuries, the survivors of these diseases survive because they have a resistance to it. And they pass that resistance down to their own children. And this creates a sort of arms race between the diseases and the people, where the people who survive because they're stronger and they have resistance. The disease that still manages to multiply in these people multiplies because it is a stronger or different variant of that disease, which makes both the people more resistant and the diseases more potent. So we have these super potent diseases traveling with mostly resistant Europeans over to the New World, where it is just devastating. Now, disease is not the only factor that destroys Native American societies, not by a long shot, but it was a main one because of the impact that disease will have. I'm going to throw out some numbers here and understand that not 100% of these numbers are tied just to disease, but it is a big factor. So on the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean, one of the first islands that Columbus, well, actually the first island that Columbus will establish a settlement on, that had a native population of about 250,000, 250,000 people living on that island in 1494. By 1538, there are 500 survivors. Most of that is disease. A lot of other important factors. The Spanish were not exactly kind to the Native Americans. There was in some cases, we could call it a genocide and it would be fair. But disease was the leading factor here. In Mexico, there were about 25 million people living there, mostly under Aztec rule or of the Maya culture, in 1500 when the Spanish start showing up on their shores. By 1630, we're down to 1 million. From 25 down to 1. That's like 4% surviving during that time period. And in total, when you look at all of the American societies, North and South America, and we try to calculate, we try to put a best estimate on how many people died of diseases that transferred over from Afro-Eurasia, and it is about 90%. About 9 out of every 10 Native Americans died of these diseases. It completely destroys a society. And when we're left with just that 10%, it becomes difficult to resist the encroachment of anybody else. The spread of religion is another thing that happens during this period of exchange. European explorers and colonists also bring their religion to them in Mexico and South America. The Spanish and Portuguese are going to spread the Catholic faith. They set up missions. They try to convert the Native Americans. Sometimes they do this forcefully. It's not always a peaceful conversion. But to this day, most of Mexico and South America does still practice the Catholic faith. In the northeast of the United States, the Dutch and English settlers will be settling there and spreading the Protestant faiths. Another thing that we should bring up here, and we will definitely go into deeper very soon, is African slavery. Now, to maximize profits, many European colonists use slave labor in mines and farms. Okay? They don't hire people and pay people to do this hard work. They instead enslave people. And at first, it was Native Americans who were enslaved and put to work in the mines and on the European plantations. But Native Americans did not make good slaves because of the previously mentioned problems with disease. They were dying at far too great of a rate. This really begins the process of the mass enslavement of West Africans. West Africans who have already had contact through these Silk Road trade routes and all these diseases through the Trans-Saharan trade routes had already developed resistance to a lot of these European diseases. They weren't going to die in the same numbers. And so in 1526, the Portuguese start the large-scale importation of slaves from West Africa into their colonies in Brazil. The Spanish will pick up on that and start importing to their colonies. And then later, so will the Dutch. Well, less so the Dutch. The Dutch wind up being more brokers than colonists. But the British will do this as well. More on that to come. That is all for today. I hope you learned something from this lesson, and farewell.